Hello, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. Today we have a rather challenging project, but one that's going to be a lot of fun. I'd like to show you how to make this flying osprey carrying a fish. Now these birds in nature have a wingspan of about 4 feet long, but this one is scaled down to about 2/5 size so we can fit in a room. The thing that you have to remember about an osprey is the distinctive shape of the wing. The edge of the wing comes up with sort of an elbow appearance, and it shows both from this side and from the profile. So it kind of looks like he's flying like this. And that way you can tell him in the distance from birds like eagles or other birds. An eagle has a wing that is very straight and more of an oval shape. So the point I'm trying to make is when you're carving a particular wildlife, you're going to want to know exactly the shape of that particular bird and know as much about it as you can. Now, this is the wing that I have roughed out here, and you can see how I've taken a 2-inch thick piece of wood and bandsawed out the shape of the edge of the wing first, and then I could lay it down on the bandsaw table and cut out the feathers and the rest of the shape. That'll save a little bit of carving time. You could also carve this just from a 2-inch block of wood, but this will make things a bit easier for us. The thing you have to remember when you're carving this wing is you have to pay real close attention to the direction of the wood grain. That's because we've got a lot of different curves on this wing, and it goes around at a lot of different angles. And if the wood should start to splinter, you'll know you're going against the grain real fast. Now I'm carving this wing with sort of an airfoil shape. It's going to be curved over the top and then hollowed out underneath, a lot like the shape of an airplane wing. So what I've done first here is I'm just rounding off the top part, and then I'll turn it over and we can start carving on the bottom. For getting in these areas here, instead of the number 5 gouge I was just using, I use a 35mm number 7. And the curve of this gouge fits down inside that hollow much better. Now one of the things that you'll notice when you're carving on a project like this is a lot of times when you're carving, because we're dealing with some delicate shapes, if you carve straight across the grain here, sometimes this tool will start to crunch the grain a little bit, especially with a softwood like basswood or the wood we're using today, which is pine. And what you can do when you're carving is you can take and actually tilt that tool so it shears through the wood at an angle. And that's like a pair of scissors. You know, if you have a pair of scissors, they don't close straight like this. They kind of close and shear as they go across. And you use that same effect with your tools, and that'll make the carving go a lot smoother if you hit some of that coarse wood. Ospreys are really neat birds, and we do have quite a few of them in the Adirondacks. Not as many as we used to have. One of the problems was they were almost eliminated by DDT some years ago. And because they eat primarily fish, and being at the top of the food chain, they're very susceptible to different pesticides and things. What happens is, as the bugs get killed off, they fall into the water, and the fish eat the bugs, or the chemicals get washed into the water, and then as the osprey eat these fish, it starts building up concentrations in their system. Now, even though DDT has been outlawed in this country, it's still sent abroad to other countries. And that's a problem for the ospreys because the young ones, after they hatch out up in Blue Mountain Lake, for all that matter, after they hatch out, they go to South America for 2 or 3 years to mature. And that's where they pick up concentration of these chemicals. And what happens is it makes the eggshells too thin for the female bird to sit on. And so when they come back up into this country, then they have a problem because the eggs won't hatch and it affects the population. But they are gradually making a comeback up in our area. They're magnificent birds, and when you see them in the air, it's just unbelievable. when they're fishing, they'll hover like a hummingbird. I mean, if you can imagine a bird with a 4-foot wingspan hovering, it's just unbelievable. And they'll sit and they'll sort of hover in the air and eyeball a fish moving in the water. And they'll just tuck their wings in and just dive down like a rocket. And then catch the fish with their claws. Sometimes they'll even go completely underwater after a fish. And then you see them flapping up to the top with this fish, and it's really quite a spectacular sight. Tighten this clamp down a bit. Now I'm hollowing the underside of the wing here, and I'm using a number 7 gouge because it's got a little bit more of a curve. This wood is going to get quite thin, so you want to take it very easy. This is an interesting project because it's one where you want to exercise a lot of caution and delicate control. You can tell just as I'm carving, this wood on these feather tips is flexing under the tool. Ospreys have a very interesting nest. It's a huge nest made out of twigs. And these nests are sometimes as big as 6 feet across. And they lay 2 eggs and raise 2 young each year. It's interesting because these birds they're very protective about their family. And I've even seen them try to drive off motorboats that wander too close to the nesting area. So when it is nesting time and I go out doing my own observing, I'll usually take a canoe or something very quiet and go several islands away and just watch them through binoculars. But I don't like to disturb them very much. They don't like it either. And if you're in a motorboat and you see a bird with a 4-foot wingspan coming down to attack you, it's a memorable sight and not one that you easily forget. Well, I get carving here, I get carried away, and boy, it's a lot of fun. Now this one I've hollowed this out, and you can see how I've hollowed down here. And this will give us the underside contour of the wing. Now for detailing the feathers, let me show you the other side that I've been working on here. And that'll give you a little idea on how you lay out the feathers. Clear the decks a bit. Let's see, let me put this over around the other side, and that'll give me a little more clearance. You have to make sure that you have your feathers lined up right on these wings. And as a general rule, the way I remember it is the feather at the tip of the wing, you see the full feather from the underside. See, they're overlapped like shingles on a house roof. And you have to remember which one is on the top and which was on the bottom. And on the underside is where you see the full feather at the tip. I draw these in with a pencil first, and then what I do is I'll take another pencil and I'll shade an area so I have an idea on just where these overlap. So when I'm carving, I don't get halfway into it and find out that I've mixed up the overlap on the feathers. Now this is important to get this right because this is what makes the birds fly. As they're flying along and they beat down against the wind, the feathers will lock together and the air can't get out, and that's what helps them to raise up into the air. And then on the downbeat, the feathers will kind of separate and let the air pass through, and that's how they can go in one direction through the air. Now I'm using a macaroni gouge to do this. And this is basically a tool that's like, well, it's like 2 V gouges with a flat chisel in the middle. And that way I can make a cut on the left and a right-hand side. And I'm going to be very gentle coming around here. This is fun. One of the projects like this, you have to remember, it seems intimidating because there's so many little bits and pieces to it. that when you start thinking about it, it can get overwhelming. But it's just like anything else. You just have to take it one step at a time. Just do one wing and then go on to the next wing, and pretty soon you'll have all the pieces together. Now to smooth this off, I'm going to use a number 2 gouge. This one is almost flat. And this one is 16 millimeters wide. And I come along and I'm going to put my finger underneath that feather because you can see that this thing is flexing as I'm carving here. And if you put too much pressure on it, it'll break off. If that happens, you just take and glue it back on with a little 5-minute epoxy glue. And come around and we'll get the bevel here. Now, one of the secrets in doing a feather like this is don't make the whole thing the same thinness all across. You can cheat a little bit and make the edges thin and have the center part a little bit thicker. Because all you see are the thin edges, so it'll have the illusion that the whole feather is very thin. There, but see, that's getting kind of close there. What I usually do when I'm carving these feathers is I'll take and I'll hold it up to the light so that I can see how thin the wood is getting. And if you start seeing a lot of light coming through that wood, then you know you don't want to go too much farther. Now for carving the rest of these feathers, it's exactly the same thing. Just take a macaroni gouge and you can come around here and shape these feathers around. And it's really no problem. I usually do them all on one side first, and then I'll flip the piece over and do them on the other. Because one of the things that you can do is, as you carve these along, you can take a knife and then just round off the edges of the backs of the feathers. And then when you turn it over, you'll have these notches to serve as a guide for when you're laying out your feathers, because you'll know where that feather line has to go. And that way you can be sure that the feathers on one side of the wing are going to match up with the feathers on the other. Tighten that down. And I'll just come around and carve these on this side too. They're starting to go against the grain there, so what I have to do is carve a little ways on this side and then come around and finish these cuts off coming from the other direction. These long, thin feathers at the tip are called the primary flight feathers. And they are the big ones that give the power to the flight. There's usually 10 of those on a bird's wing. And they start from the outside and then work their way in. So when you're making the feathers, you count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about the 10 there. And then there's a noticeable notch, and then you have 10 more secondaries. And that's how you keep track of how many feathers are on the bird's wing. We just keep doing that until you get all these feathers carved in, and then you can go on to the next piece, which is the tail. And that's carved very similar to the wing, although there are some differences. The thing with the tail is that you want to make sure that you have it curved. You don't want to have it just perfectly flat, because otherwise it looks static. And you want a little bit of a curve in there like on a real bird. To carve that curve out, take and clamp it down. Then take a gouge like a large number 5 and just scoop that wood away. Now once again, we can use our secret of making the edges thinner than the center portion. And that way we can cheat just a little and have some added strength to our wood. So you have to remember this wood is more brittle than a real feather, so you have to make some special allowances when you're carving it. Now after I've hollowed out the bottom part, I can start shaping the top. And I'm going to use a flat chisel for that. Let's see, I've got a number 2 over here that should be just about right. I don't want something with too much of a curve because I want something that, so I can give it this concave surface. And this is where you got to be very, very gentle because the wood is getting pretty thin. You can almost start to see some light through the edges there. Whoops. Oh well. That's called going against the grain, but we have enough wood here we can get by. Sometimes one of those splinters can take a nosedive and you can be in trouble. Clean that up from the other side in a minute. And I'm just going to thin down this edge a bit. Now when I cut out the wings and the tail, I try to leave a a big tab of wood at the end. That gives me something I can hook my clamp to. When I go to fit these in, I'll just cut off a joint and then fit it into the body of the carving. There, see, that works a little better. We've still got a 1/64 of an inch to play around with there. No problem. Okay. Anyway, just keep doing that until you get it shaped down to where you want it. And then, keep grabbing the wrong vise here. These C-clamps are great for working with because they have a nice low surface on there and they don't get in your way. For doing the feathering on the tail, the top feather is it's like on a roof. And the top feather here, the center feather is on the top, and then the other feathers underlap that on down the tail. So you can think of the tail as being like shingles on a roof. And this is the roof line, and then they just go down below that. And I'm just using the macaroni gouge to shape that down. For the center shaft, you know that line that goes down the center, I can just take and make 2 cuts with my macaroni gouge, and that'll do that. Then it's just a matter of drawing in the rest of the feathers here. There's 12 tail feathers in an osprey, so you just want to alternate those down until you get to the bottom. Now when you're doing the underside of the tail, you have to remember it's just the opposite as with the top. And when you get to the underside of the tail, the 2 large feathers that show are on the bottom, and you have one on either side, and then they overlap just the opposite way until you get to the center, and this is the top feather, which is buried by all the others. So that's just a couple of handy tips for getting your feathers organized. Now, when you get the tail done, let's see, what else do we need? Oh, a fish. We've got to give this guy a fish. And to cut out the fish, we've got a couple ways we can do that. What I did for the fish here was, so I don't drop my C-clamp on my toe here. You draw out the profile or the top view of that fish first. And then I'll cut that out on the bandsaw. And that will give you something that looks like this. And then you take your pattern, which you've drawn up from a photograph or observation if you can observe fish, lay that on there, trace around that, and then just cut it out. Then it's just a simple matter of taking your whittling knife and doing a little whittling on this guy. Now, fish are tricky to observe because even if you happen to be a fisherman or you are with a fisherman, as soon as a fish is caught and it comes out of the water and it dies, the colors change. Everything changes on it. So fish can be kind of tricky to observe. And to get the color just right when you're painting them, it's best to be able to observe live ones. The best place I have found in my neighborhood is I go down to the Adirondack Museum, and they've got a fish tank there with a glass front, and you can go in and you can study these brook trout from different angles. Now the only tricky part on this fish is going to be carving these thin fins and also this tail. Now, as you remember, when we cut this tail out, it came around here, so our grain is going this way on this piece of wood. But we start getting up this tail, and we're dealing with a lot of cross grain. So, you have to remember that on the inside, you have to bring your tool down this way to carve. And on the outside, you have to come down like this. Because if you forget and start carving the other way here, you'll just knock off a big chunk of that tail. And you don't want to do that. If that should happen, just take some 5-minute epoxy and glue those two pieces back together, and it'll hold out just fine. Now the other tricky thing is in doing the fins. And on a fish, the fins, first two on the bottom, come in pairs, and this one is a single one, so you want to cut that down as a single. For making two of them, what you can do is just start and making a notch in from either side here, and just keep making small chips to bring that down. See, these are going to be sort of cross-grained too, and if you get too much pressure against those when they're thin, they might break off. Like I said, this is a great project for learning about the sensitivity of the wood. And remember, keep your tools sharp. That is the secret for doing something like this. Well, anyway, that gives you an idea on how you get that separation cut down in there. And then just keep working along through that until you get to exactly the right shape that you want. And when you get done, you'll have something that looks a little bit, well, looks a little bit like this guy here. And see, this is where we've cut the fins down. And I've gotten these. And this one's single. And once again, remember, the trick on doing this is don't make the wood a uniform thinness all the way through. Just make the edges thin. And you can have the center portion twice as thick as the edges. And it'll look thin. It'll have the illusion of being thin, but it also will be fairly strong. Then just sand your fish down, and he'll be having his dinner ready for him. Now the last part that you need to work on is going to be the body. And the body is not too difficult. Actually, that's one of the more simpler parts of the project because it's a nice, straightforward, thick piece of wood. Now from my observations, I drew out the sketches of my bird, and then from that I drew out patterns for the side view and the top view and so forth. And with this one, what I did was I cut out his profile first because I knew when I looked at this there was a flat spot along the back, and I could lay that on the bandsaw table, and then I could cut out these round curved parts. And that gives me a blank to work on. Now you can whittle this out just with a knife if you want, or if you want to go a little faster, you can use gouges. Now the trick is, this is sort of an egg shape, and it's hard to hold in a vise. But one of the things you can do is you can take and fit these pieces you cut off back on it. And notice I'm going to stagger those down just a little bit. And then you can fit those in your vise. And that'll give you something to grip it with. And that way you can rough out some of the big chunks and then do the finishing details with a knife. There, I think that'll hold. Then to rough them out, just use a gouge, number 2 or number 5, something that doesn't take out too big a bite, and just carve away. Remember, all this looks a little bit complicated, but you just take it one step at a time. It's just like anything else. Just take it one step at a time, and don't look at the whole thing and everything you have to do. Just look at the small pieces. And it really goes along quite quickly. Well, I mean, quickly for a project like this. Usually something like this can take several weeks to do from start to finish. So don't worry about rushing it and getting it done by breakfast tomorrow morning. And just keep rounding off those edges. And then turn them over, round off the bottom, and then just do the rest of the detailing with a knife. Now, I think that's about all the time I have today. So what I'm going to do is work on this guy, and next week I can show you how to put the body and the wings and the legs and the tail all together to come up with our bird there. Well, thanks for dropping by, and until next week, this is Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
How to Carve Wood, a book of projects and techniques by Rick Butz, is available by calling 1-800-950-WMHT. With more than 200 pages and over 400 photographs and illustrations, including patterns for some of the projects in the series, this companion guide presents important woodworking techniques. For your copy, call 1-800-950-WMHT. The cost is $17.95 plus handling. Please have your credit card ready when you call.